All right, hey guys, this is Mr. Barreline coming at you with your next video lesson. We're going to be talking about the post-World War I era today, and this is a complex issue moving from wartime to peacetime, and of course everybody's happy that the war is over, but there's going to be a lot of fear and uncertainty in this new world. So we're going to talk about that and how it manifests itself in the United States. So the end of World War I brought a lot of rejoicing, but it also brought a lot of problems. You had an influenza epidemic that killed more than 500,000 Americans, about 600,000 Americans. Farms and factories that had been making tons of materials for the war effort now are forced to close down because demand decreases for their products. Also, returning soldiers have trouble finding work. You know, you have these guys that have been off in the war, and people have moved in to fill their slots in the labor force, and there's trouble in the economy reintegrating those people back into their former jobs. Also, you know, you had emotional turmoil. You had lots of disturbing political effects of the war, lots of anti-immigrant sentiment, especially towards Germans and German Americans in the United States. So this is a problem. These sentiments gave rise to a movement known as 100% Americanism, which celebrated all things American while attacking ideas and people that it viewed as foreign or anti-American. Of course, the funny thing being that, you know, at this time in American history, a large percentage of Americans were, you know, either children or immigrants themselves, children of or grandchildren of immigrants. And really, when you think about it, the vast majority of American society all descend from people that came from somewhere else. So this is a new movement that rises, and you see nativism rise up periodically throughout American history, specifically during times of conflict, turmoil, and fear. Another rising tide of fear is the fear of communist infiltration into the United States, and this becomes known as the Red Scare. And the Red Scare really is caused by a couple of issues. First, the rise of the Bolsheviks. Americans worried about a new enemy. The Bolsheviks, who were led by Lenin in Russia, had gained control of the government during World War I. And 5 years after that, Russia becomes part of a new nation called the Soviet Union. The Bolsheviks were communists. They wanted to establish a new social system without economic classes, without private property, where all people should share equally in society's wealth. And the Soviets called for the overthrow of capitalism, and they predicted that communism would inspire workers to rise up and crush capitalism. So communism is really an idea of global revolution, not necessarily a government system. Most Americans were very frightened, obviously, of communism. Most Americans embraced capitalism and feared a rise of the working class. And of course, the Hun, which had been the feared symbol of the German during the war, kind of is replaced by a new target, which is the communists, and communists are known as the Reds. So when you're looking at political cartoons or political speech and things like that, anytime you see the term red, especially from this time period, it's generally referring to the communists. Anyway, communist parties, however, did form in the United States after the war. Some of them did advocate the violent overthrow of the U.S. political and economic system. So this kind of adds to the fears of the Red Scare. And this is what this time period becomes known, the Red Scare, the widespread fear of communism and the spread of communist influence in American society. There was a failed plot in 1919 in which bombs were mailed to several government officials, including U.S. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, who was a progressive politician during the progressive period. But communists were suspected to have been behind this plot. And although the communist threat was really minimal during this time, Palmer and the rest of the government took it very seriously. In New York, legislatures voted to bar 5 legally elected socialists from office and make a law making it a crime to call for government revolution. Supreme Court did find that law unconstitutional in 1925 case of Gitlow versus New York. But anyway, Palmer was a key leader in the government's anti-communist campaign. He attacked radicals in what are called the Palmer raids, and he justifies them with wartime laws that gave the government broad power against suspected radicals. So some of these laws that we talked about that have been passed during the war are going to be used after the war to fight not just communism, but a whole group of radicals that were speaking out against the government. Of course, for aliens or citizens of other countries living in the United States, just belonging to certain groups that were considered radical could lead to deportation or being sent back to their country of origin. So in late 1919, Palmer's raids arrested thousands of people, deported hundreds, and in time, the Red Scare dies down, but what happens is overseas communism begins to kind of fail. The Soviet Union goes through a difficult period in the post-war period, and it becomes a little less of a threat initially. Now, this Red Scare is going to help contribute to the decline of organized labor in the United States. During the war, President Wilson had sought good relations with workers, and basically as a result, organized labor had been able to win many gains: shorter hours, higher wages, and labor leaders wanted to build on this in the post-war period. However, Wilson was focused on the 14 points and promoting the Treaty of Versailles. He wasn't worried about labor disputes. And the sinking post-war demand for factory goods hurt a lot of industries. So people were being laid off. The factories were shutting down. Profit margins were shrinking. So it was more difficult for workers to argue for better pay and shorter hours. Also, returning soldiers expected jobs that weren't there. So as a result, you have lots of labor strife. Unhappy workers and strikers were basically, you had excess labor, so if people caused problems in the workforce, their bosses would just fire them and hire new people. Also, the Red Scare damaged labor's reputation because a lot of organized labor organizations were actually either communist, socialist, or otherwise left-leaning. So it made a lot of people suspicious of their leadership. So the showdown between labor and management in 1919 really devastated organized labor. Unions lost membership, national political power, and it took another decade and really the Great Depression to restore organized labor's reputation and bargaining power in the United States. And organized labor really takes a hit in 1919. It was probably the most explosive time in the history of the American labor movement. In 1 year, over 4 million workers took part in over 3,000 strikes nationwide. And in almost every case, labor comes out the loser. A few of the big ones that we'll talk about. In Seattle, labor unrest at the shipyard spread across the city, igniting what becomes known as a general strike. And this is one in which all industries take part. And what happens is workers in one industry will strike, and then other labor unions or workers organizations, labor unions, whatever, will strike in support of them. So it leads to a general strike. It means basically the city is shut down. The strike still, despite the fact that it shuts down the city, fails to get any of its demands. And it actually discourages industry in Seattle for years and allows businesses and business leaders to paint workers as unreasonable and willing to wreck the economy. In Boston, the police force itself went on strike to protest low wages and poor working conditions. And, of course, police weren't working. The city descends into chaos, and Governor Calvin Coolidge had to call in the militia to end the strike. And this makes him a national hero and national figure. And, of course, he'll become president down the road. United Mine Workers, who had a no strikes pledge during the war, went on strike in 1919, and they did win a large wage increase, but not better hours. Steel industry also struck in 1919 with limited success. So one of the few successes would be the UMW, the United Mine Workers, during this time period. part of the issues that faced labor at the time was increased competition for jobs. And this increased competition led many people, along with the Red Scare, to strike against foreigners and immigrants in the nation. And you have the rise, we talked about 100% Americanism, you have the rise of nativism, or distrust of foreigners, which produces a culture clash between the country's earliest immigrants and its newer ones. Many nativists, the people who were descended from the earliest immigrants, were Protestant Christians who were from Northern and Western Europe, places like England and Germany and France. And they didn't like the new arrivals from Southern and Eastern Europe, most of whom were Catholics and Jews. Nativists argued that these groups were less willing to become Americanized. Labor leaders, along with nativists, pushed for immigration restrictions because the new arrivals were usually willing to work for low wages. So you have this odd pairing, teaming up of labor leaders and generally well-to-do nativists that push for immigrant restrictions because immigrants were willing to work for low wages when it undercut American workers. So as a result, you had a couple of reactions to immigration. First, the federal government passes really the first law establishing immigration quotas. In 1921, they established a quota, the set number of immigrants to be allowed from various nations. Then in the National Origins Act of 1924 was passed. And this set quotas for each country at 2% of the number of people from that country currently living in the U.S. So the idea was to reduce immigration from countries from the origin countries of new immigrants. So, for instance, there were a lot of people who came from England, right? Who had immigrated from England. So 2% of that number was much larger than, say, the newer immigrants from Italy or Greece. So it has the impact of limiting that newer immigration. It almost completely eliminates immigration from Asian countries. It also seriously damages the diplomatic relationship between the United States and Japan. And of course, we'll see the impacts of that later on. Also, immigration leads to a resurgence of anti-immigrant and white supremacist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan has a revival during the 1920s. They expand their message beyond just African Americans, but also targeting Jews, Catholics, and other radicals like communists and socialists and people of that nature. The Klan slogan of the 20s became Native White Protestant Supremacy. So they expand their message beyond just anti-black rhetoric into anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant rhetoric. And it moves from the South into other parts of the country. In fact, the largest Klan rally in history is held in the 1920s. A popular court case that happens during this time that really shows kind of the divide of ideology and anti-immigrant sentiment, all that kind of stuff, is the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. Late 1920s was a court case in Massachusetts. Nicola Sacco and Bartolome Vanzetti were arrested for armed robbery and murder. And they were two Italian immigrants. They were also anarchists. They were radicals who sought the destruction of the government. The evidence against two men was very weak, but during the trial, it became apparent that they were on trial for their beliefs as much as for their crimes. So amid great publicity and protest, the two men were convicted and sentenced to death. They were executed in 1927 controversially, but by then the nation had largely recovered from the Red Scare and the turmoil of the post-war years. During their trial, it was highly charged politically. It was like the O.J. trial of its time. I mean, everybody was following it and watching it. And historians disagree on whether or not they were in fact guilty, but the reality is that the proof presented at the trial was circumstantial at best, and mostly had to do with their affiliation with radical groups, and obviously the fact that they were immigrants as well. So these problems are going to continue to kind of boil under the surface in America during the 1920s. Even though the 20s is going to be seen as this great period of wealth and progress, we'll see how these problems combine to create a downfall.